Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to talk to Professor Joseph Kaminsky. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Joseph is an associate professor affiliated with the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the International University of Sarajevo. He's also a research associate at the brilliant Ummatics Institute. His current research interests include religion and politics, comparative political theory, and new approaches to Islam and public reason. His work has appeared in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including PS, Political Science and Politics, Social Compass, Thunderbird International Business Review, and Religious Studies Review. He's also the author of The Contemporary Islamic Governed State, a Reconceptualization, a book published by Palgrave in 2017, and the amazing book, one of my favorites, Islam, Liberalism and Ontology, a Critical Re-Evaluation. Really worth reading that if you're into those subjects, which is actually being currently translated into Albanian, I'm told. And he received his PhD in political science from Purdue University in the USA. Now, he's also the author of a recent paper titled The Other Legitimate Game in Town, Understanding Public Support for the Caliphate in the Islamic World. Now, this is a very interesting topic, investigating the sources of public support for the Caliphate in the Muslim world. And I think the Caliphate is a key institution in Islamic governance. And Joseph has undertaken original survey work, which he will share with us today, inshallah. So over to you, sir.
All right. Well, assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's a real honor and pleasure to have you guys here to hear me. This is the first time I've given this presentation or on this particular paper. So just a little bit of background on the paper first, because I think people always find the provenance of the papers to be interesting. And it shows you how the paper sort of developed a little bit. So this paper is one of my relatively few co-authored papers with two just fantastic scholars who I wish I could be as smart as these guys. Professor Mujtaba Ihsani, who's currently a DAAD fellow in Pakistan at the Qaid al-Azim University. Previously, he was at the University of Munster, and he has a pretty extensive publication background. And Dan Silverman, just an amazing young scholar, assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon, who has a very interesting book coming out very soon with I believe it's Oxford University Press, but I don't remember all the details. If you want to get those details, you can message me. But Dan and Mujtaba are very quantitative oriented and very research design oriented scholars. And so they sort of began this project by, there's a lot of, there's some like empirical data collection that was done in Pakistan, trying to get attitudes towards the Caliphate. And they were sort of looking for somebody who could help them sort of beef up the theory section. And that's when they invited me to participate in the paper.
Right.
So I sort of joined the paper, and, we sent it to a few journals. And it was interesting because some of the first journals we sent it to, like, we got very positive feedback about the statistics part and about even the framing part. But they were very critical of the fact that we were it sounded like we were almost saying something positive about the Caliphate. That was sort of the response I got. One of the reviews.
Are these Western?
Yeah, these are big time, top level academic journals. I don't want to throw any names out there, but
yeah.
The big ones that we all, if you're in political science or religious studies, you've heard of them. And one of the reviewers came right out and said, like, why don't you show why you should have another variable that shows correlations between educational levels and support for the Caliphate, so you can show that people with lower education support the Caliphate, right? They want us to basically restructure the argument to say, like, crazy dumb people who aren't educated support this, and of course we were like, that we're not doing that, because that's like completely not what we're arguing at all. So this is one of the pitfalls when you're doing sort of research like we're doing that is controversial, in the sense that we're sort of making claims and pushing arguments that aren't necessarily seen as the norm within the Western academia. But eventually we did find a very good journal that was obviously, we're very happy to have published with the American Journal of Islam and Society, which is much more friendly to our kind of research. And we got great reviews and feedback. People helped us to build our argument to make it stronger rather than change it to fit their their needs and their agendas, right? So in the end, it all worked out, alhamdulillah, right? So in the end, we managed to find the perfect journal for this article that we think the audience will really, it'll resonate with the audience of the journal too, right? Because some journals, the audience might not really be interested in this kind of paper, but I think Aegis is one of those journals that would work. And once again, I thank Professor Ovner Andrew for helping make this all happen, his fine editorial management work of the journal.
He's great.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the paper.
Yes.
As I give you a little bit of background. So basically, I'm going to just sort of summarize the main points, right?
Yep.
So in recent times, we've seen sort of there's been a lot of research coming up throughout the 80s and 90s about this idea of what do Muslims accept democracy, or are Muslims inherently an authoritarian peoples? And if so, is it because of the religion itself, right? And one of the things that we this is sort of like a trope within the literature for like the last 20 years or 30 years. It's, in the 90s and early 2000s, this was sort of the argument. There's a cultural reason why Muslims are inherently undemocratic, right? It has nothing to do with structure, or it has something to do with structure, but not so much. And in the end, it's just the religion and the people themselves reject democracy. This was sort of one of the themes being pushed in the 90s. But a lot of research has sort of disproven and shown that this is not accurate, right? So indeed, when we start talking about caliphate, or the word caliphate, right, make the point that it's a term that itself invokes fear, right? People hear the term and it's utilized. It's immediately sort of a some kind of like dog whistle. People see it as talking for some kind of ISIS-style murderous autocratic entity, right? So people, and then there's a reason why people have these attitudes towards the caliphate. First off, most Westerners know very little about Islam in general, let alone what the caliphate entails, right? Because that's obviously a concept nested within Islam. So if you don't know the basics of Islam, then you're going to obviously probably not know anything about the caliphate either. However, people for some reason have opinions on this. And one of the reasons is because of powerful political leaders, right? We talk about George W. Bush talking about the dangers of al-Qaeda wanting to, quote, establish a violent political utopia, which they call a caliphate, where all would be ruled according to their hateful ideology, right? So this is coming from the President of the United States post 9/11. And this is a pretty loaded normative statement, right? This isn't just some kind of neutral observation. Clearly, there's a reason this kind of language is being used. We found that Bush used the term caliphate 15 times in 2006, with the term thrown in 4 times in one speech alone. More recently, Sebastian Gorka, we all probably remember him from the Trump administration, commenting that, quote, the caliphate is not just some idea of crazed extremists hiding out in the remote parts of Central or South Asia. It's a real entity, end quote, right? So again, trying to, keep everyone afraid of this concept, right? So indeed, this term is often utilized by Western political actors to sort of identify people, to sort of cut off roads of discussion before they can even really happen, right? So it's the same thing with the term Islamist, right? I really hate the term Islamist because it almost universally has a negative connotation.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to be an Islamist? What is an Islamist?
It's a good question. Right? I've looked at, from time to time I look up the online to try and find a definition of Islamism and Islamist, and I always end up with like 300 different definitions. And it seems to be everyone's all over the place about it. It's basically whatever you want it to be. It's usually bad. It usually has something to do with politics, Islam and politics. But it's not a kind of clear scientific dictionary definition that kind of just fits everyone's ideas. It's all over the place. I don't know what
it's in the sociology terms, we'd call it a floating signifier, right? You ever heard this term, a floating signifier, which basically means it's sort of an empty term that can mean whatever you want it to mean within however context you frame it within. It's sort of like the word terrorism, right? What is terrorism? Well, there are certain UN definitions that I'm not going to get into right now, but even those are contested, right? But at least there is something that I guess you call an official entity has tried to issue a statement on. But the term Islamism itself basically means whatever the person saying it wants it to mean, but it almost always means something bad. Very rarely do you hear somebody talking about Islamists in a positive or even neutral context, right? If you just go on social media, especially pro-Zionist accounts, pro-Israel accounts, will very often talk about the Gaza being led by the Hamas Islamist, right? The Islamists, everything you got to get that Islamist in there because that is really meant to scare people, right? Mm-hmm. So the Caliphate sort of functions in a similar way, right? Mm-hmm. And you'll often see social media as well talking about Hamas wanting to establish their caliphate, right? Which is clearly not what they're interested in doing. That is not their mandate whatsoever.
However, other things on their plate at the moment, like
of course, right? So the idea that they're trying to create a caliphate is patently false, but nonetheless, the term makes it double scary. Hamas, scary enough, but you have caliphate in Hamas, it's double scary, so it gets more attention, it gets more retweets, and people make more money, right? Okay, so one of the things we wanted to discuss is like, we see, as I mentioned, that we hear the term a lot, and we know that many Muslims support the concept, but what do they actually mean by it? What does the caliphate mean in the idea, in the mind of the typical Muslim, and how popular is it as a political alternative? Mm. This is very important because if we're going to start talking about the caliphate in any kind of even abstract terms, we have to understand what do people who are going to actually live under it and support it ostensibly mean by it. What do they have in mind? What are they looking for? I mean, we live in the year 2024. We're not going to recreate the exact same institution that existed 1,200 years ago, or even 500 years ago, even 100 years ago, right? Mm. So I think one of the misconceptions is a lot of people have this idea that the caliphate of Umar radiallahu anhu is going to be brought back at some point in that form, which is really crazy because, like, if you look at the small amount of territory that was under the control at the very beginnings of Islam, you would understand that it's not even possible, right, to have that exact structure. So what is it that people want? And we sort of find that people don't exactly know what they want, but they have some idea of what they would like to see, right? Yeah. So while the specifics aren't necessarily fully understood, we do sort of see that there is a general idea of what people would like to see. So indeed, one of the things we found, to sort of sum it up real quickly before I get into the details, is we find that the caliphate is viewed in what we call instrumental material terms as a model that can deliver inclusive and effective welfare and justice system throughout society, right? So in many ways, this is sort of similar to how people in the Muslim world see democracy, which is understood as an instrumental or output-oriented in some, it's sort of understood in that context, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means when I talk about the three different models we brought out. But the first point I want to make is in our literature review section, we sort of talk about the research done on this idea of the Islamic democratic deficit, which I talked about briefly at the beginning of this discussion. This idea produced by people like Sam Huntington that Islam is more naturally resistant to democratization, that Islam is inherently authoritarian, rejects pluralism, all these concepts that were popular by some major figures in the 1990s and early 2000s. However, recent public opinion surveys, including some fantastic recent work by a scholar at Kansas State, whose work I recommend, named Sabri Jifji, has really talked about these attitudes towards democracy and towards politics, and show a very different picture than what was produced by the research published in the 1990s, right? So we see major survey projects, World Value Survey, Global Barometer surveys, and major firms like Pew and Gallup showing that support for some kind of representative governance, or what you may call democracy in the more abstract sense, right? We're not talking about a specific Western liberal democracy per se, but we're just talking about the idea of representative governance, is often seen as being in support by over 80% of populations, right? So 4 out of 5 people living in Muslim majority societies in recent surveys support some kind of representative political institutions.
Can I just pause you on that? Because I'm very, very confused, because often when I understand what I understand by democracy, I mean, is it maybe like the word Islamist? It kind of means whatever you want it to be. But for me, democracy is all about sovereignty. So like the American, you're American. So sovereignty is about the sovereignty of the people, the sovereignty of human beings. That it's not a theocracy. There's no religion. There's no church, separation of church and state. It's a secular, man-based, man is sovereign. But in Islam, as far as I understand it, God is sovereign. Islamic democracy, God is sovereign, not man. And so this idea of democracy could be very, and then you talk about representative government as if that is what democracy means. But demos, literally the Greek word demos, meaning peopleocracy, or rule by the people, is not the same as representative democracy. I would suggest it's simply not synonymous anyway, because democracy has particular philosophical and metaphysical characteristics. Perhaps. So I'm really curious about what we're really talking about here. When people in the Muslim world say they want democracy, are they, as you're saying, what they're really saying is they're not saying, well, we want the sovereignty of man and we reject God. What they're saying is they want representative government, they want justice, you want institutions that reflect the people and not oppress them and exploit them and tyrannize, etc., etc. You see what I mean?
No, exactly. I think you said it much better than I even said it just now. This is why I said democracy is sort of the the abstract concepts. Right? We're not talking about a liberal democratic form where sovereignty is sort of secularized and state and religion are separate. We're just talking about, as you said, a republic, kind of a system where people sort of have access to the levers of power, where people are somehow able to choose and have participatory access into their government. Sort of the opposite of an autocratic system, right? So Muslims in Muslim majority societies are overwhelmingly rejecting the models of governance that underpin their current societies, and they like to see things that correlate with some of the things that we see in what I guess you call democratic governance, right? So indeed, democracy itself is a very, it's a very thick concept. There's a lot of different moving parts to it that I don't have time to get into right now because I think it'll take us too far off course. But we found that the democratic support doesn't really relate to religious factors either, cutting across different degrees of Islamic religiosity and Islamic ideology. And there's a numerous amount of surveys that show this. So both religious Muslims, more moderate, or more, I don't say moderate's the wrong word, but like less religious Muslims and people that are overall secular, we find it didn't really matter. Everybody does support this idea of the people being able to participate in their politics some way, right?
Right.
So this is sort of interesting. This includes people that consider themselves very religious, right? So you don't have many people living in Muslim majority societies openly advocating for, monarchs and unaccountable rulers, right? Most people want to see some kind of small d democracy, if we want to use that term, that is a part of their system in some manner, okay? Right. While the attitudes may vary on a precise flavor of democracy that is ideal, the conclusion of the work that we have surveyed is, as I say here, and this is exactly what you just said, Muslim majority populations want representative forms of government just as much as their non-Muslim counterparts. Mm-hmm. And this image was only further reinforced by what has become known as the Arab Spring, which when massive anti-authoritarian, pro-democracy, whatever, protests materialized across the Middle East, ousting entrenched autocrats in many different countries. But then we ask the question, is this idea of democracy, now we're getting to the more thicker concept, is this the only model that enjoys substantive legitimacy within the Muslim world? So we see that this idea of democracy, however we want to frame it, this idea of representative governance, let's call it that, perhaps to be a little bit less controversial, perhaps, I don't know. It does enjoy legitimacy, but what about, is there anything else? Or is there sort of a combination of things that enjoy legitimacy, right? So we see some interesting things here. In the first wave of Arab Barometer survey fielded in 2006 and 2007, the percentage of respondents agreeing that governing their country in a democratic way was good or very good was seen as at the level of 90%.
Wow,
which is pretty high.
So where was this, in the Arab world or in Pakistan?
Yeah, this is Arab Barometer survey, which is
Arab world, right?
Survey, yeah. So this is covering Arab societies and a very large N number of 7,323, which is that's a big number of people to survey. Right. Like a lot of these political polls you're seeing have N number. N number means the total number of people surveyed. N number is like 500-600, right? So we're trying to determine whether Trump or Kamala Harris is going to win on 600 people. This has 7,323. So this is a pretty safe number. This is probably pretty accurate of representation of attitude. And 90%. In contrast, the percentage thinking that a strong non-democratic leader was good or very good was only 14%. So we see a very small number of people that support a strong-arm dictator, right? So these numbers sort of support the conventional wisdom that we're talking about. However, when asked about their views on being ruled by a group of experts who make important decisions for them, sort of like a shura council, 70% said this is very good. More surprisingly, when asked about a model that is a combination of all three choices, a strong leader, or one that's sort of democratic in a way that has a set of experts, we see 53% say that this is a good model. So we see a little bit of confusion here, right? We see when more variables are added in, people sort of, their opinions sort of shift on this, which is really interesting. So it shows that we have broad support for this sort of general concept of representative governance, but that doesn't necessarily entail the rejection of having experts lead politics, having religious leaders involved in politics. And as a matter of fact, in an article I'm currently working on, I was looking at the most recent survey data. I think it was Arab Barometer survey again. I found some very interesting statistics. 55 to 60% of people in many countries in North Africa want to see religious leaders and religious clerics, like actual imams, play a role in governance. Over 50%. So this shows that there's this, and this is true in the West as well. Everyone says they support democracy, but then when you ask them about the specifics of what they mean by it, you get very different answers. The Muslim world, just like the rest of the world, is multifaceted, and people sort of want to see different things. They want to see good governance. They want to see representative institutions, but they also are sort of cool if there's a strong leader that can get this done, which seems sort of contradictory, right? A strong leader and democratic institutions. Is this really possible? Well, perhaps it is. Perhaps we need to think a little bit outside the box. So this is why we sort of, this is sort of what initially led my two co-authors to pursue this question, right? Because they saw that this is sort of confusion and attitude of what people want to actually see. So, like, people, they found when they were talking to them, everyone seemed to have something sort of positive to say about the Caliphate. They saw that this was something that resonated with a lot of the people they were surveying and they were interviewing. And they saw that this sort of resonates with the attitudes of other people in other surveys as well. So my co-authors thought, looking at all these sort of confusing discussions about democracy, representative governance, strong leader, theocracy, whatever, they thought, what do people mean by this caliphate? Because surely a wealthy man living in a urban area in Pakistan is going to have probably a very different conceptualization of what that actually means in practice than somebody who grew up in a rural, more tribal area with limited access to certain resources, right? So what do people mean by this? The concept of the caliphate is hardly fixed. Indeed, this flexibility is actually contributed to its enduring relevance in many ways, right? The term on its own doesn't really tell us so much about any specific political behavior, though, right? So what do we mean, right? For the purpose of the article, we're grounding our understanding of the caliphate in one overarching axiom articulated by Hugh Kennedy in 2016, namely that the caliphate, regardless of its scope or more specific institutional form, is about the just ordering of Muslim society according to the will of God, end quote, right? That's sort of the sine qua non, if you want to use that, of what the caliphate is, right? So that is the bare bones, simplest definition without getting into any institutional forms or specifics or bodies of, administration.
It is theocentric then. It is theocentric, explicitly theocentric, according to the will of God. And that's not just like the Americans say, in God we trust on their dollar bills. No, this is serious. It's
organized according to the will of God as understood through Sharia. Right?
Exactly. And also, isn't the Prophet also to do with a successor to the Prophet himself, not in his prophetic function, but in his political leadership role? There's a sense of looking back to that original archetype, the Prophet himself.
Yes, of course. Yes, looking back to the original prophetic model and looking back to the Rashiduddin Caliphs. Caliphs. I mean, this basically is sort of like this idea is what people want to see, right? Right. In the words of Muhammad Rashid Rida, right, he understands the caliphate as the focal point of unity, the source of legislation, and the path to order, the guarantor of the execution of rulings and laws for the Muslim Ummah. Right. So this is basically this is the assumption we're having. Like, this is something that everybody who supports the caliphate ostensibly supports. So if you're going to reject these things that I just mentioned, then you don't support the caliphate. Right?
Yeah.
So beyond this, though, beyond this very bare bones grounding, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to let our data and analysis drive our understanding of what political model this actually entails. And indeed, as the paper shows, only a handful of surveys have ever actually asked about the opinions of the Caliphate as an actual political model. So we have a figure that talks about this that I'm not going to get into because I don't have the picture in front of me. But like we see that multiple surveys have been conducted over many different years in many different ways, showing the the levels of support vary, but they in many cases there is a majority that does support this idea. Okay, we have other surveys as well. The Maryland program on international policy attitudes, known as the PIPA surveys, did some surveys in the mid 2000s, finding a very high number. In our chart, we show that 77% in Morocco, 77% in Egypt, in the 80s in Pakistan, all support this idea of all countries in a single Islamic state or caliphate. That's the way it's worded, which obviously is problematic because an Islamic state and a caliphate are not necessarily the same thing. Okay, but nonetheless, this is one of the problems with these surveys: is they're written by people who don't really understand the nuances of what these terms actually mean. They're number crunching data people, which is fair enough. So indeed, we see that overall the cases that were studied in this PIPA survey, on average, 74% of support across the cases analyzed for this.
So 74% on average across the surveys.
Yeah.
And that's literally three quarters.
With an N number, again, this is important. I keep bringing this point up for my stats people. An N number of 7,227. That's a lot of people. We're not talking they surveyed 5 people. We're talking over 7,000 people, and they came up with 70+% that support this.
So
this is very, very interesting.
Yeah.
So indeed, a healthy majority of people support the Caliphate. And but I should point out, though, that in the wake of the Arab Spring, there has been some evidence that there was a temporary decline in support for political Islam. Right. So Arab's Barometer survey in 2019 showed a decline in the trust in, quote unquote, here we go again, the term Islamist parties in Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, Iraq, and Libya. However, more recent survey has shown that it's sort of slowly bouncing back. Right. So there was sort of a post-Arab Spring lull, but once again, I think what's going on right now in Gaza has sort of reinvigorated sort of support amongst certain demographics for Islamic governance. Or
so what this means, if I just, I mean, without diverting what you're saying, but I just wanted to sort of comment that these figures, 3/4 of the Arab population supporting the Caliphate, will be very worrying for many Western policymakers. They're going to be very worried about this. They're going to see this as a very retrograde, backward kind of step, a cause of concern for policymakers in the US and Europe. Now, I don't agree with that at all, of course, but that's going to be their response. They're not going to be happy with this because they, from their view, want to spread secular liberalism to the Arab world. They want Egypt to be like California. They want it to be secular and full of liberal values and all the problems that come with that. So this is very interesting that we are seeing this multipolar world where people in the Muslim world, the Arab world anyway, and in the West have very different conceptions in some ways about politics, about rulership, about governance. There is some overlap, but there's also a very distinctive difference. And we've got to learn to live with that. That's what I'm trying to say. The West has got to learn to respect difference, respect that people are not all secular, atheist, liberals. Some of us actually want to have societies focused on God and the Sharia because it's good for mankind, it's good for families, it's good for justice, it's good for the afterlife, for our success in this life and the next life. People care about these issues. So I think the West needs to learn to understand that if it can be bothered to do so. Perhaps it won't, and respect this as well, because we're not but Muslims are around. We're going to stick around for a long, long time.
Well, the thing is the Western governments know this. Like, if we know these statistics and facts, I can assure you people in the State Department have also read them. And this is probably why we see the retrenchment in recent years exacerbated under Trump. But, it's a policy under Biden as well, where it's not about promoting democracy in the Middle East and the Muslim world anymore, because they know this. If Muslims are given the choice, they're going to have some kind of Islamic governance or people that are support unifying into a larger entity beyond the simple nation-state model. Yeah. So this is why we see this major turn in U.S. policy, even in the way it's framed, in support of pliant autocratic dictators that will keep the people sort of in check. Right? There's, Shadi Hamid wrote a really interesting book where he has actual quotes from people in the Obama's State Department talking about we got to basically saying we should support Sisi, and we're not going to call this a coup because if the United States declares it a coup, there's certain legal ramifications about what they can and cannot do, and they have to withhold aid, et cetera, et cetera. The United States didn't want to call it a coup because they actually sort of not only tacitly supported, but there's evidence that they actually had agents in Egypt fomenting rebellion against the Morsi regime. So indeed, I think Western governments are fully aware of this, hence why we see a massive shift away from the language of democratization and political representation, more towards the sort of autocratic stability approach. And I think it was Hillary Clinton who actually said that, like, in a sort of a document that was sort of uncovered, that the big mistake was letting the Palestinians vote, because by letting them have elections, they voted for Hamas, which implies that they shouldn't have been allowed to vote. The best way to keep these people in control is to keep them under the thumb of an American-approved autocrat.
Because it's very ironic, because she's a Democratic politician. I mean, she's a spokesperson for the Democratic Party in the United States.
It's cross party lines.
Very ideology.
Republican, Democrat. It's the American. It's the norm right now in American politics to sort of oppose, maybe not explicitly say I'm opposed to democracy because that sounds too obvious, but to do everything in their power to avoid having Muslims being able to actually have representative say in their politics. It's just safer to have an autocratic ruler who's going to sort of keep order and play by the international rules that the United States set. These rulers know that by playing by these rules, by following the procedure, they can get lots of money and resources and loans that they don't have to actually pay back from the United States and from the EU. And they can sort of live lavish lifestyles at the expense of their people's well-being. And a lot of rulers in recent times have chosen this path. And that's bad. Okay. So let's get to the model here we talked about. So we lay out three potential visions. So what do people mean by the Caliphate? Well, we first have to come up with three models and then see what our data best fits. So we come up with an autocratic vision, which prioritizes obedience and loyalty, a more democratic vision that prioritizes elections and representation, and finally what we call a technocratic or a good governance vision, which prioritizes institutional functionality and justice. So we first then give examples of an autocratic caliphate model, right? So the autocratic caliphate model we came up with, and hope this doesn't offend any viewers, but we sort of argue that Hizb ut-Tahrir does have, without a doubt, a relatively autocratic model of caliphate, right? In which the prioritization is about obedience and loyalty to a centralized authority figure, right? The reference to these two particular, so the other group we talked about was ISIS, which I think that's self-explanatory. But we're not trying to make the point that the two groups are the same. Please don't misunderstand what we are. What we're just simply trying to say is both entities sort of share this idea that centralized leadership and obedience needs to come before good governance and welfare states. While the latter seems desirable within both models, an institutional core characterized by centralized authoritarian leadership is seen as sort of a necessary prerequisite for Islamic governance. We talk a little bit more in details about Hizb ut-Tahrir because that's the more interesting case. It's hard to deny that the model is very centralized, and we talk about their own draft constitution, which talks about the Khalifa has the absolute right to conduct the affairs of citizens according to his opinion and ijtihad. He is allowed to adopt from Mubah, the Islamically permissible or neutral, actions needed to conduct the affairs of the state. The Ummah has the authority to appoint the Khalifa, but no right to dismiss him after he's legitimately attained bay'ah, or the pledge of allegiance from the people, right? The Khalifa is the state. This is a quote from HT's constitution. The Khalifa is the state. He possesses all the power and the function of the state. Sovereignty, both in theory and practice, as we can see here, lie within the figure of the caliph, right? This is pretty clear. Now, Nabhani's model does call for a consultative assembly, in which Muslims and non-Muslims alike would be allowed to vote and even hold office. So it's not totally authoritarian, but in practice, this consultative assembly really doesn't do much beyond rubber stamping decisions by the Caliph. It did not have independent legislative power under the model, and its role was basically offer its opinion on the ruler's policies, and basically the ruler could do what he wanted with those opinions. So this isn't really this is obviously a pretty centralized and only way to describe it sort of autocratic vision, right? So that's just the one model we laid out. The second model is sort of the other end, which is a very democratic model, in which we see this multi-level notion of sovereignty, and then we give the example of Sayyid Bey, who was writing at the times of the abolition of the Khalifa in 1924, right? His argument was that the TGNA, the Turkish Grand National Assembly, was the best Islamic form of rule according to his reinterpretation of Islamic sources, and that the Caliphate should be reinterpreted in the light of contemporary current political events. So basically, he sort of argues, he talks about legitimate versus illegitimate caliphates, and we can really see this idea for Sayyid Bey, the importance of democracy and democratic representative institution. And he thought basically the Turkish Grand National Assembly could serve the same function of the caliphate. So this is a much more very democratic model. We can also find some democratic trends within the thought of Maududi, right? So if one digs deep into his work, one can see the possibilities for some genuine Islamic, albeit illiberal, democratic models of Islamic governance, so long as certain preconditions are met. Maududi's vision of the Khalifa is based on this idea of Hakimiyya, which holds that ultimately sovereignty belongs only to Allah. He talks about this idea of the Khalifa of Allah, which all humans are vicegerents, representative of Allah on earth. And the caliph, in that sense, is the caliph among caliphs who must apply the law of Allah and Sharia. And so long as he fulfills this duty, he may be selected by whatever procedure possible, including full democratic elections, which Maududi himself labels as popular vicegerency. Maududi also advocated for substantial separation of powers between the leader and the other branches of government, with an elected legislature and independent judges balancing the chief executive. So he definitely took separation of power far more seriously than the more autocratic-minded groups, which sort of made it much more difficult, if not impossible, to sort of remove the ruler if he wasn't doing his job. The third iteration of the caliphate that we articulated is what we call the instrumental or good governance model, that's anchored in this idea of providing justice, in this Islamic idea of ihsan, which can be understood as excellence in both deed and in action. Right? Ihsan is also related to this idea of being benevolent towards the people, or graciousness in individuals and in dealing with others, which is, of course, an essential aspect of Islamic social justice. Ihsan, specifically in governance and political leadership, underwrites good governance in this caliphate model we're outlining. We can find the ideas of ihsan in the ideas of the great Shafi jurist al-Mawardi, who argued that the caliph is, quote, the successor of the prophet, who protects the religion and manages and governs the worldly affairs of the community by it. The caliph, however, is not a prophet himself, nor is he an unassailable sage or some guru who must be deferred to at all times. Functional institutions in ihsan and leadership are paramount for Mawardi. He outlines 10 matters of public affairs that were binding upon the caliph, all of which were related to world administrative competencies, which include ensuring the employment of trustworthy people, the appointment of worthy counselors capable of undertaking the task delegated to them, safeguarding of public funds, right? We see in Mawardi nothing about the caliph being the most pious member of the Ummah or the most knowledgeable scholar. The caliph is viewed here in instrumental terms as a competent leader that upholds Sharia. In more recent times, a good governance approach can also be seen in the thought of Hassan al-Banna, who, like Mawardi, believed that the caliphate was an obligation upon Muslims. Al-Banna took seriously the importance of a just economic system within Islam and had his own 10 principles, all related to good governance, that also were about maximizing the benefits of public resources for the Ummah, protecting property rights, private ownership of property, and ensuring halal monetary dealings by the state. All of these things relate to this notion of ihsan within the model, right? So under this good governance model we laid out, the caliphate is viewed and valued neither as a true Islamic democracy nor a restrictive expansionist theocracy that alone can abolish un-Islamic practices by sheer will. Instead, this model conceptualized the caliphate more so within domestic rather than though not necessarily exclusively in terms of transnational politics. The term of let me say that again. The model we're looking at sort of views the caliphate more in domestic rather than transnational terms. So this caliphate doesn't reject this idea of transnationalism, but this idea does sort of see the caliphate more within the context of providing public goods and swift and effective justice and an inclusive welfare state for ordinary Muslims. We can find this model, this idea throughout Islamic history, right? In the writings of Ghazali and Mawardi, etc., etc. So this is sort of the three basic models we laid out. And then, so after laying out these models, we sort of, this is where you make your hypothesis. We sort of hypothesized that the model with the strongest association would be this third model that we laid out, right? So the hypotheses we laid out were the first hypothesis. So this is now we get into the sort of more empirical part of the paper. So what I just laid out is a little bit of the literature review and the three models we sort of articulate, and then we're going to sort of test our data to see which model is supported. So hypothesis 1, those who want government to focus on providing public broad goods, such as inclusive welfare states, and or effective criminal justice systems are more likely to support the caliphate. That's our first hypothesis. Our second hypothesis, those who want government to focus on restricting public morality, such as banning the consumption of alcohol, enforcing the veil, are also more likely to support the caliphate. Okay. Our 2B hypothesis, I just laid out 2A, is that 2B hypothesis, those who value obedience to authority in the law are more likely to support the caliphate. Okay. Hypothesis 3, wish to see the strict application of Sharia are more likely to support the caliphate. Hypothesis 4, those who hold more negative or hostile views to the West and its presence in the Muslim world are more likely to support the caliphate. So then once again, we sort of looked at different sort of mass conceptions through the different data sets we had already found. And we sort of found that, let me look here at the data real quick so I get it right, that certain variables obviously showed more likelihood to support caliphate, right? And the ones that we saw at the highest were those about applying Sharia law and Sharia as this idea of welfare, right? So this is very, very important. And interestingly enough, though, we found less correlation with this idea of rejecting Western values or removing U.S. presence, and lower with obedience to authority as well, and also lower with women, Sharia being concerned with just public morality, women's dress. So we saw here that the attitudes that most strongly correlated with support for the caliphate and predictors for support in Egypt, Indonesia, and Pakistan, at least, were these more broader ideas related to justice and public welfare provision. So then we sort of looked at the original survey instrument that were my colleagues designed, and they went to Pakistan to conduct this the survey data, and they've made some very interesting findings here. We turn to the findings here as well. So again, they found that when sort of surveying people, the most important features of the caliphate were seen as welfare and justice and upholding Sharia, right? More so than these micro-level concerns with public morality, policing, making sure people are dressed properly, people policing individual private practices. This was much lower. The main concern that people had who supported the idea of the caliphate, and the thing that they thought represented the caliphate in their vision, were those concerns related to welfare, justice, and upholding Sharia.
Can I just ask, what percentage of the population then supported the caliphate system in this survey in Pakistan? I assume
this survey wasn't about who supports the caliphate. Everyone who answered this survey does support the caliphate. Right. We're trying to see the supporters what they value. Most in the caliphate. Okay. So to summarize these findings here, So I'll just read some of the key parts of conclusions because it's very hard to present a 35-page paper in an oral discussion like this. But here's the conclusion part. I hope what I said made sense because if you read the data and you read the paper, it'll make more sense. But I'm trying to summarize statistics and models, and it's not as easy. So the nation state has not been particularly kind to Muslims over the last century. We all know that. Significant levels of support for the Caliphate system amongst Muslims, therefore, shouldn't be that surprising, considering the state of affairs the Muslim world really finds itself in. To date, though, very few scholars have focused on how the Caliphate is actually conceptualized by contemporary Muslims in practice. Is it perceived as something totalitarian? Is it democratic? Or something distinct? To investigate, we first surveyed some of the more influential elite visions of the Caliphate throughout history. And while this only yielded a broad overview of several of the most prominent elite visions, it highlighted not only the concept's tremendous diversity, but also some of the models that have been promulgated and linked to Islamic thinkers that we discussed, right? This brings in a sharp focus to building blocks of several different conceptions of the Caliphate, leading us to examine which ones have been absorbed by Muslim populations today. So we lay out our visions, and then we find the following. Our first set of findings suggests that support for a Caliphate is intimately connected to popular support for the implementation of Sharia. No questions asked. But the nature of Sharia envisioned in a Caliphate centers around what? So when people talk about Sharia, this is another sub-question. What are they talking about? They're mostly interested in this general idea of providing effective systems of welfare and justice, more so than policing modesty or morality. Not to suggest that those don't matter, but when people think of the Caliphate, the first thing that comes to their mind is justice and welfare, not policing morality. This understanding actually parallels Brandon Kenhammer's earlier empirical work in Nigeria, which showed how local Muslim population there perceives Sharia as the vehicle that will help unify the Muslim population behind a single religious identity and root out problems of elite corruption and underdevelopment and facilitate better overall governments. This also parallels with the findings of Fair, Littman, and Nugent, who see public perception of Sharia and Islamic government in Pakistan, showing that most people there understood an Islamic government, though not necessarily a caliphate, but an Islamic government in general, as one that implements Sharia by providing services and security for its citizens, which they go on argue is associated actually with increased support for democratic, in a small d sense, values. Our findings also suggest that blind obedience to authority and opposition to the West are not all that influential in shaping political attitudes of most Caliphate supporters. This suggests, in line with our good governance model's assumptions, those who support the Caliphate are not necessarily motivated by its international end. This is a very important point. So what I'm trying to say here is those who support the Caliphate aren't motivated by overthrowing imperialism or transnational, destroying borders and having one massive entity. While that's something that is a long-term goal, I'm sure, for most Muslims, the immediate thing that people think about when they think of the Caliphate is this idea of welfare and justice within their locale. That makes sense? So people are not motivated to support the Caliphate simply because of these internationalist ideas. They, like any person in the West, is primarily motivated, or anywhere, is primarily motivated by local politics. They're motivated by things that will affect their daily lives, which is interesting. It shows that people who are interested in the Caliphate aren't necessarily, utopian in thinking. It's not just if you support this idea, you're some type of utopian that's believing in some kind of global revolution overnight. What it's showing is that people who support the Caliphate are also pragmatic, and they have the same concerns that any other citizen has anywhere else, which is with their own locale well-being, justice, welfare. When we turn to the original survey instrument done in Pakistan, we compare these two systems more deeply and directly. In the survey, we asked respondents not only to rate their support for the Caliphate and democracy, but to select two characteristics that are most important of each system. Okay? The results show that despite some differences, there's a convergence in public conceptions of the two models. Indeed, in both cases, the more normative considerations of elections, freedoms, and economic equality took a backseat to the more instrumentalist qualities of well-functioning systems of welfare and justice. So when people conceptualize what democracy means in Pakistan, in our survey, it wasn't about elections. It wasn't about these normative, these more micro-level things. It was really about the instrumentalist qualities, larger qualities of welfare and justice. So what we see here is that people sort of saw the Caliphate and democracy in an idealized sense as supporting similar things.
So they're not, I mean, to say the obvious.
We're talking about, the idea of representative governance. We're not talking about American-style democracy or British.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say with the Declaration of Independence and,
No.
iterations of John Locke's liberalism and so on. We're not talking about that, which is a very European thing, of course, to do with Pacific property in Europe, to do with Christians killing each other for centuries, of course. That's not the issue in the Muslim world so much. We're talking here about, as you say, representative government, justice, welfare, all those things that Islamic system is intended to provide, of course, not excluding, nevertheless, this wider pan vision of a Muslim world that's not split into statelets where everyone, you have visa to go from Egypt to Jordan, for example. I have an Egyptian friend who, has to get a visa to go to Jordan. He doesn't need a visa to go to other countries that are not Muslim majority. It's all very frustrating. So there is that large division as well. Yeah.
No, definitely. I mean, I think the thing that's interesting for me when conducting this research is to see that people still support the instrumentalists, the more normative values as well, right? But they're primarily driven by the larger conception of welfare and justice. So when you ask, the point I'm trying to make here is when you ask typical person in Pakistan in the survey, when I say caliphate, what does that mean to you? Their response would be justice and welfare, providing justice and welfare for my community. And we found similar results in the other places that we ran the regressions on as well, which is very interesting. So this sort of shows that the idea of the caliphate in the minds of people, this is sort of the main takeaway from this, shouldn't be seen as, if you support the caliphate, you're some autocrat, you're some ISIS supporter. It's actually sort of the opposite. If you actually support the caliphate, you actually are supporting justice and democracy, and I hate to say democracy, but you're supporting the idea of people having a say in their politics, people being active, people being able to participate in the political processes and institutions. You're someone who supports accountability. You're someone who supports oversight. You're someone who ultimately supports limits. Nobody here in these surveys expressed the idea that the caliph should be seen as some kind of demigod or some kind of unquestionable ruler who has ultimate
some kind of papal figure, some kind of pope.
Right, exactly. So that's a good point. Yeah, it's a good way to frame it. So indeed, the caliph is not really being viewed by the people in these surveys as some kind of pope whose word is final and binding. Rather, it's seen as sort of a instrument for upholding Sharia, which was seen through all of the surveys as being the number one thing that the caliph should do is uphold and promote Sharia.
These survey results are very, very significant, I think, because they can, on the one hand, reassure people in the West who perhaps don't know much about this subject that support for the caliphate isn't in no way anything to do with supporting ISIS-like activities at all. That's not what's going on.
Exactly. That's one major thing, yes.
That's one major thing. But the support for the caliphate is framed in terms of concerns with justice and welfare, as you say, which are very intelligible to people in the West. This is not something we have to kind of stretch our imaginations to comprehend. We're all concerned as human beings on this planet with similar issues. But the configuration is Islamic. So it's centered around Sharia, centered around pleasing God and so on, but in a way that is now still recognizable to other people. So it hasn't got this alien, strange, threatening character to it. It's something that is rooted in real life and real life concerns that we can all understand. So that this is good news in that sense. You've actually now got actual survey research that you can put under people's noses and say, look, this is the reality.
No, exactly right. No, I mean, once again, you're framing my paper better than I am. You're doing a better job in this than I am. You read the paper very closely, closer than I wrote it, I guess, right? But no, you're absolutely right. It demonstrates that in the West and in the Muslim world, there's similar concerns are shared. People want to see Muslims who support the caliphate aren't just crazed lunatics who want to return back to a world that they can never return to because we're not in the 7th century anymore. This is the caricature that people like Bush and some of these neocons pushed in the early 2000s about the hateful ideology of the caliphate, whereas we showed the exact opposite. The people who support the caliphate are deeply concerned with welfare, with justice, with people's private property being protected, people's rights being protected within an Islamic context. So as you say, we are different, yet not all that different, because in the end, in the West and in the Muslim world, there's a concern with governments making our lives manageable and live we can flourish within these societies. And this is one of the critiques of liberalism, right? Is that it's sort of failing to uphold that these days.
This is the book, folks. If you want to read a good critique of liberalism, your book, Islam, Liberalism, and Ontology, A Critical Reevaluation. You mentioned people like John Locke and others, Western thinkers, and you evaluate their thinking in the light of critiques. Yeah. So
I mean, so this is our paper here, and I really hope people get a chance to read it. It's available in the American Journal of Islam and Society, Volume 41.
Is it behind a paywall though? This is what I have.
No, it's not. That's the best part.
Excellent.
It is not behind a paywall, which means download it, cite it. The more
I will link to it. I will link to it in the description below, folks. You have no excuse not to read it.
No excuse not to read it. And like I said, even if you don't understand the statistics parts, in which I'm not going to lie, some of the statistics are beyond me as well. My colleagues at Carnegie Mellon are doing the math, but I do understand the basic parts. But like, if you don't understand the statistics, don't let that scare you. Sometimes people see these papers that have like numbers and data sets in it, and they'll sort of freak out. Just read the explanation of what the statistics mean. You don't have to know what the 0.51 and the 0.26, what the R-squared values are. Don't worry about that. Just worry about the qualitative analysis of what that data means. And I think we can learn some very important things here. And I really think future research should continue to dig deeper into what the Muslims actually mean. Because what the Muslims actually mean by the Caliphate. Because if an entity like the Caliphate or some kind of unified, Muslim conglomerate, whatever you want to call it, comes into being, for that to function and work, it's going to have to take into account how people see what its function should be, right? And research like this can help people if that time, inshallah, comes, to create and make sure their institutions reflect the values that people want to see. So if a caliphate came into being, speaking abstractly, perhaps the best idea is not in its interest to immediately go out and, start, banning, women from going to school or enforcing hudud punishments on day one. Maybe that's not the best approach. Maybe the best approach is sort of focusing on these broader issues of public service provision, rooting out corruption, and providing good governance, since that's what the vast majority of people who support the Caliphate want to see they actually do. Once again, not people don't support the hudud, because they do, but the overarching thing that is pushing people in when they envision the Caliphate, what grounds their support for it, is this idea of promoting the broader ends of Sharia and the broader ends of social welfare and justice.
Yeah, I will say, and I look to the day when the West can finally get the point, it can understand that in terms of world peace and coexistence, a Muslim world that is truly happy and confident with Islamic governance is actually good for everyone. It's good for the West as well, because then you will have Muslims who will be confident and strong in their own systems of belief and governance and the caliphate. And that's good for everyone, rather than having a divided Muslim world split up, where you have tyrannical rulers. This is not good for anyone, because it's not generating peace. It's not generating international cooperation. So I think the West needs to come to understand, through your research and other things, that actually the caliphate is part of the solution to good relations between the West itself. And the West must understand that. Until it does, it's always going to be at war with the Muslim world, literally and metaphorically, which it is, constantly invading and oppressing. And because it doesn't get it, and it needs to get it so that everyone can coexist peacefully on this planet. That would be my view.
This is a great point. And let's be honest, from the West perspective, functioning Islamic entity, functioning Islamic society means less uncontrolled migration to their lands. It's in their interest for these states to be functional rather than dysfunctional, because none of these migrants are coming to Europe because this is they want to. They're coming out of necessity. The people are risking their lives and basically throwing away their lives in many ways. They're coming to Europe where they know they're probably not going to be able to get back to their country. They know that it's going to be very difficult. So once you make these societies livable, people will stay. People aren't people aren't, let's be honest, people aren't illegally migrating from the United States into the EU, right? People are coming into the EU from countries that are failing, countries that are not prosperous. And it's indeed, if we can see people happy with their societies that are actually representative of what the people want and are actually helping bring forth stability and the generation of wealth when you see that happen, then you'll start to see it will be in the West's interest. I'm sorry, my child is crying in the background. It will be in the West. She's okay. It'll be in the West's best interest because indeed it will help bring forth a more stable world. Now the question is this though: does the West want this stability? We have to think of it that way. Does the West necessarily want it? So I think that at one level, some people in the West, some leaders in the West do want to see more stability and less migration. But there's a lot of money to be made off of war as well.
Yeah, this is a very good
question. We have competing interests with the West isn't a monolith either. Let's be honest, there are certain entities right now that are making profits hand over fist because of the conflicts going on throughout the Muslim world. So, to be sort of cynical here, maybe it's not. Maybe the West doesn't want to see this because it will bring potentially stability.
America has this policy of basically maintaining hegemony in the military sphere, political sphere, and technological sphere globally, and this is incompatible. That the idea of the multipolar world, real multipolarity, not notional, where you actually allow other systems and other peoples to govern differently, is incompatible with that foreign policy objective of the United States. This is something that goes back decades, I think. So there have to be shifts in attitudes in the West, and we're not seeing that at the moment. Certainly not with Biden, not with Trump, of course. But
no, I think really the idea of a unified Muslim civilization under whatever institutional form you want to call it, the Caliphate, some kind of Muslim EU, I don't know, whatever you want to use the term. Let's use the term unified Muslim civilization for the time being.
Yeah.
I think that's something that it is sort of scary though for the West because that would entail collaboration across economic spheres as well as military spheres. Because let's be honest, Muslim majority societies, in the world we live in today, military strength and military power is very important, and many of these places simply don't have the military power necessary to be able to stand on their own, right? I always make this point to my classes. Pakistan always seems to get treated a little bit. The United States never wants to go in bad relations with Pakistan. Yes, the generals are sort of in the pockets of the Americans. We know that. But Pakistan has one thing: they have nuclear weapons.
Yeah. And
that's something that gives them. You have to take them seriously. You can't. The United States could not, as much as it would like to. The United States cannot treat Pakistan like it treats Iran.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's something to think about. And I think that building more collaboration in the military sphere, in the economic sphere, in education as well. And I hate to say it, but the vast majority of the world's top universities are in the West. 80 of the world's top 100, I believe, in the last World Economic Ratings were in the United States, Germany, and UK.
Yeah, I'm shocked at little old England. The three of the top universities in the world are actually in England. Just three of the top.
And I think 60 or 70 are in the United States. There's one or two. It's just in Switzerland. There's a couple. There's a few other in continental Europe. But the states with the best universities, there's a correlation between them also being powerhouse states.
Yes,
we're talking about Germany. We're talking about UK. We're talking about the United States.
Yeah,
right. The Muslim world needs to continue to invest in education. Muslims shouldn't have to go to America to get an education, a top level education. Whereas the Harvard and the Yales and the Oxfords of the Muslim world. There are good universities in the Muslim world. There are, and I'm not trying to say there's none, but there needs to be more. And they need to be more accessible to the people living there. They can't just be the elites.
Great universities in Doha, for example, which I've seen, Istanbul, of course. But I remember the story of the young student in days gone by under the Ottoman Empire, which was a transnational empire. He could do his first studies in Damascus, then he could go to Cairo and continue his studies there and go on to another place like Marrakesh or something. But he didn't need to get visas. He didn't need to get special permission from the government, and because it was all one world, it was the Muslim world, and we've lost that. And now we're all split up into these largely British or European created nation states, which didn't exist 100 years ago, and they are. About education, the education has been hampered by that too. This kind of nationalism. But anyway,
but this is a good point you make, that we live in a world that's been so shaped by and damaged through these Western innovations. But the question is, though, we have to find a way as an ummah to address these questions. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that unchecked migration isn't a problem, because it potentially is. We discussed this within our our Ummatics discussions with our leadership team sometime, and I bring up the point. Let's say a caliphate was established tomorrow. Like, it would probably be very chaotic, because if you had open borders, right? People from the places that are not functioning would want to run to Dubai, or would want to run to, right? No, that's a real thing, though. We can't ignore that. Now, of course, how can we handle it? How can we create a world where ultimately we don't need to have the system of visas and the system of passports and border checks, but at the same time prevent the mad rush to these wealthier polities, which would obviously overwhelm and bring chaos and destruction ultimately? These are the kind of questions that need to be thought about seriously. This is what I think needs to be done when people discuss things like the Caliphate or discuss the unified Islamic civilization, is to take a long, hard look at these very real problems. The very real problem of migration. It is it's a great thing. It's Islamic, but it can also be very problematic if it's not handled properly and if it's not handled scientifically. And these are the kind of things that more research needs to be done on, because if the Muslim world ever does unify without having these things thought out first, it's going to be very chaotic and messy, and sadly, it'll probably be pretty violent. So we got to all think.
Why the Ummatics Institute is so important, and intellectuals such as yourself who are bringing these very realistic assessments of the issues, very important. But for me, I'm reminded that the Hadith, which speaks of a time, authentic Hadith, which speak of a time when there isn't a caliphate, which is now, but then the return of the caliphate on the original pattern of the caliph. And so in a sense, this is a gift from God as well. It's not just like a Marxist kind of utopian project where we construct this system in this kind of materialist way. No, it is actually a spiritual, it's a God-given gift. And also that it will return. And there's no doubt it will return. Why? Because God has promised it through his prophet. So it's not if it comes back, it's when it comes back.
Yes.
And the promise is it will come back on the basis of the original good, wholesome, godly system of the prophet upon whom be peace himself. So ultimately we're optimistic, and the West is going to have to deal with it, like it or not, because it will come back. The question is, what do we do in the meantime to try and make it happen in a way that is intelligent, non-chaotic, and so on, because we just can't sit around on our hands not doing anything. We're supposed to participate. So
no, I absolutely agree. 100% agree. I mean, we can't just wait for magic to happen, for this day to show up when everything is going to be fine. That's simply not how the trajectory of history works. Yes, we do believe the caliphate will return, but it can return. It doesn't say how it's going to return. And it doesn't necessarily say it's going to be done in a peaceful, loving way either, right? So it's incumbent upon us to shape how that return happens. Will it be a nice, pleasant transition, or is it going to be something that has years and years of bloodshed and violence? Like, the more we think about these deep questions, the questions of deep difference, the questions of competing ethnicities living within one larger entity, the question regarding the role of different genders within the polity, the Islamic unified civilization, the caliphate. If we don't think of these questions in advance, when the time comes and we're not ready to answer them when they confront us, it's going to be problematic. So I call upon more young people to take seriously the need to think about these questions. But I think to sort of return full circle to what we started with the article, you talk about there will come a time when the caliphate upon the prophetic model will be reestablished. And we see some hope in the sense that the Muslims we've surveyed and the data we looked at indicate that that's exactly what Muslims today want to see, right? The caliphate, the rule of the prophet wasn't characterized by chasing down women for not properly covering every part of their body, or arresting people on the spot, or mass surveillance states. That wasn't the call of the Caliphate. It was about justice and providing welfare and providing people a sense of Islamic groundedness. And that's exactly what people want to see. And alhamdulillah to that.
But it's not yes, but it's not just Muslims. I do profoundly believe that many Christians and others will be attracted to this amazing civilizational model and will seek refuge from the breakdown of secularism, the breakdown of the family, and there's those strange values now being imposed on our children and so on. They will seek refuge in the Muslim world, because they will be one of the things about the Caliphate is pluralist. Its DNA is pluralist. It will allow Christians to be Christians in an Islamic context. Whatever may happening now, I don't know, in wherever, that is the normative position. So they can find refuge within Islamic world where they can be Christian and not be threatened by secularism and these strange ideas that are poisoning their children's mind and our own minds as well. So I would think that I would hope that they would be welcomed as refugees, almost a Christian hijra, even you can put it that way. And this would apply to people of goodwill, they be Jews and others, who will find a wholesome, godly civilization in the Muslim world. And so we might actually see, instead of migrants coming from so-called global south to the west, we might see a different kind of trajectory, a different kind of movement of people.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great point. This is another thing that has to be theorized by those who are in support of a unified Islamic civilization. The question of how do we incorporate non-Muslims into the Caliphate? Yeah, because they will be there. Right?
Absolutely, they want to be.
The Caliphate is some exclusionary project. Historically, it included many different people from all walks of life.
Absolutely.
So again, how do they get to also participate in the polity? We can't just lock them away in the corner and say, you do your own thing and we'll ignore you, because that isn't going to work. They will need to be given their own space, their own millet sort of kind of thing. But at the same time, they will also need to be able to find a way to participate in the affairs of the larger political entity. Now, the question is, how do we go about theorizing that? How do we make that happen? And that is a question that, we're still working on. And that's one of the questions I'm sort of working on as well right now, specifically in my current research. And, I think that, this is really, when we talk about unified Islamic civilization, we have to move beyond slogans. We have to move beyond al-Islam hula hal, right? Or Islam is the solution. We can't just live in slogans. We can't just live in simplified, cheers. We have to actually sort of think deeply about this. And the thinking needs to come from various disciplines. It can't just be political scientists. It can't just be theologians. We need to talk about Islamic business models, Islamic entrepreneurial models. What does an Islamic business model look like? How do we unify Muslim businesses to create a kind of situation where we have like this is something that the Chinese are known for doing in Malaysia and in Indonesia, where they basically work together to strengthen each other's businesses, and they survive and they thrive in these settings. How do we create that kind of camaraderie amongst Muslim businesses? How do we encourage Muslims to start businesses that need to be started? Right? Being a social media influencer isn't creating jobs, right? We still need to produce stuff. We still and these are things that also need. So we need economists. We need all scientists. And I think that's why this idea of unified Islamic civilization, Ummatics project, in the broader sense, beyond just the organization itself, but the larger Ummatics project that we're all a part of, needs to be a very open, wide tent project, and it needs to try to get as many different voices involved as possible, because that's how we'll all benefit from each other.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Well said. Well, that sounds like an excellent a positive end note there to conclude on. So thank you very much indeed, Professor Joseph Kaminsky, for your time and expertise. Absolutely fascinating and really important research you are doing, which, as I said, I'll say again, is linked in the description below. Please click on it. Please read the research. Never mind about the stats. Personally, I can't deal with stats, but just read the the commentary, the interpretation, the analysis of those, and let this continue, this conversation, this dialogue, this research for in the service of the Ummah. Ultimately, this is what it's all about. So thank you very much indeed.
All right, thank you. Jazakallah khairan. Thank you, Paul, for this terrific opportunity, and I thank the audience for listening to me talk for over an hour.
Oh yes, it's all been worth it. Thank you very much indeed. Till next time.
Salam.